Hey everyone, Mrhappy here, and in this video I'm going to be sharing with you my thoughts on a forum post that was put on the official Final Fantasy XIV forums just a few days ago. This forum post is about endgame gearing in Final Fantasy XIV, and it's posted by none other than one Sfia. For those who may not know who that is, he is a prominent member of the hardcore raiding community and a fellow FC member of mine. We've had him on State of the Realm a few times, and he has no shortage of experience when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV. He has done hardcore raiding from everything from World First, Savage, and Ultimate levels of progression to just grinding out his Island Sanctuary way too quickly. Seriously, Sfia, slow down. But he made a very well-structured post regarding gearing in Final Fantasy XIV, the things he likes about it, the things he doesn't like about it, and I wanted to provide some more input on those things, or at least share my thoughts on what was posted, as it has been a forum post that has spread quite like wildfire. So looking forward to going over it. I haven't had time to read it up until this point, so let's see what Sfia has to say about endgame gearing in Final Fantasy XIV. Two things before I get started. One, feeling a little under the weather, so if I just seem weird, that's why. Number two, I'll include a link to the official forum post, and if you wish to participate in the discussion, well, you can do so in my comment section. I do, of course, encourage you to go to the official forums and engage with this post, as that gets general visibility, and hence why Sfia posted it on the official forums and not just on some twitlonger or something like that. So as to not mince words, we're going to read everything verbatim, and then I'll react to it after that. Having played Final Fantasy XIV continuously since A Realm Reborn, as much as I enjoy playing the game and the complexity increases in harder content, the gearing has become progressively more and more stale. Right off the bat, I think this is a completely fair statement to make generally, regardless of how you feel about gear progression and trying to compare it to, of course, as people do, World of Warcraft, where we have very reliable, very set gearing processes. It doesn't make the gear any more exciting. It's more of a means to an end and not a real reward, I suppose, at the end of everything. It seems like the game wants us to feel rewarded for the content we do, but knows they have to give something of value in return back to us. And for gear, that's a less than exciting prospect. I want to start on a positive note and say the reliability. There you go. The reliability of obtaining gear over time is a huge success. Regardless of the time frame in which this happens, the core system of guaranteed desired drops is well done. People will have varying opinions about the time frame in which these should be achieved, but that number is more easily changed than the reward systems that currently exist, tomestones, and raid tokens. I believe it is important to maintain this structure while addressing some of the negatives that exist in the gearing system going forward. So a really good positive note to start on. I kind of just hit on it right before that, but we're of the same mind here that we are glad that the gearing system, at least on the base level, is what it is. But that doesn't mean it couldn't be better. And I think a lot of people see posts like this as complaining or whining. You can love something and still want to see it be better. And that really gives that kind of vibe right off the bat. So very disarming, I suppose, initial statement here before we get into the nitty gritty. So now let's go into the issues. To name some of the current issues. Issue number one. The rate of gear acquisition from tomestones is too slow, considering the game is heavily advertised and enjoyed as a one character can play all jobs system. Playing multiple roles or even multiple jobs within the same role in some cases, looking at you, caster, can result in simply taking far too long to acquire all the gear necessary to perform optimally on them. This makes gearing in patches before an ultimate especially restrictive. I was going to say, as I was reading this feels like something specifically for a raider that is clearing Savage, can clear Savage on multiple jobs, but needs to gear jobs for Ultimate. That's really the only gearing hurdle we have in the game currently, or at least one that is enforced by the game itself. For Ultimate, you really want to be as close to best in slot. And the amount of gear you can reasonably acquire between a Savage patch coming out and an Ultimate patch coming out is to some degree limited, largely hindered by tomestones, which are weekly capped. I have even mimic some of these statements recently, saying they need to let loose the reins a little earlier than they are right now. We used to be even more restricted. They started giving us the Savage unlock a little earlier, but it's still not always in the greatest of positions. So I totally feel with him on that particular level. But I think it's also the only level to which it really applies, because everything else in the game doesn't really have a tough enough gear requirement to stop you from playing whatever you want. Now, I see even disregarding, so I'm assuming that's going to refute my point here, even disregarding content which is desired around best in slot gear, there's a social expectation to bring the job with the highest gear. This is reinforced by item level restrictions on the party finder, increasing as the tier progresses. Yes, so as I said, the ultimate is the only thing the game enforces. The player base, on the other hand, can be right, just downright disgusting about what their item level expectations are. I'll give you a great example. There's been word of healer shortages as of late. So what did I do? I said, oh, I'm going to go into the PF as a healer. Let me join some clear for one, some helping of friends, and see if we can get some people through P5, P6. Minimum item level 615. Now, the raid hasn't even been out for 10 weeks yet at this point. It hasn't been 3 months. But I have spent all that time gearing my first job, my main job, Monk. I haven't really had spare tomestones, or I haven't had that many to put specifically towards healer, because I also need to gear another job potentially for ultimate ranged fizz. I always keep that as a backup. But you know, I'm like, oh, I got full item level 610, I got healing gear, I make sure to meld it, I got food, I got pots, and I'm generally knowledgeable about these encounters. I won't be a hindrance even if I don't have as much experience as, say, a career healer. So let me go join these PFs, and bam, I can't, because full item level 610 crafted gear is, what do you know, not item level 615. Now, granted, the solution to this, I guess, isn't necessarily more gear. It's joining parties that aren't setting item level restrictions so high, but they're more and more frequent. So it becomes an issue with the game, despite the fact that it is a player-enforced restriction. This restrictive gearing timeline results in feeling like after spending a single tombstone on one job, I'm locked into that job for the remainder of the progression cycle. Yeah, I mean, that's completely true. People have even brought up the idea of like having at most a week to refund the piece and spend the tomes again. But after the week, whatever piece of gear that you have, it just kind of resets. I've seen a whole bunch of things where people who are not 100% sure and they might need a little bit of reconsideration do want something like that. And if you buy multiple pieces in a week, that gives you a greater deal of flexibility to make the decision, as opposed to just being like, oh, I'm about to hit, you know, cap on my tomestones and I don't really know what I'm going to gear all the way up yet. There's a lot of little nuanced bits to it. But one of the greatest parts of the Final Fantasy XIV job system is the ability to play all jobs on one character. With the current gearing system, I'm limited to one role per patch, depending on what I play. Yeah, I felt this a lot more in Endwalker, and again, I do think it is because of the community's perception of what is an acceptable amount of gear to bring to various levels of encounters. And as such, I've had similar feelings. I've called for similar things. I think we can allow gear to be obtained more easily earlier on. At the very least, by the time the odd-numbered patch hits, some limitations probably need to be brought down, even if not outright removed. Because some, you know, plans when it comes to joining for an ultimate, or plans when it comes to trying to help out friends, etc., etc., the longer we're restricted from doing those things, the less we're likely to engage with those systems. So if I'm able to, let's say the loot lockout for Savage is completely removed in the odd-numbered patch, right on the patch, not at point X5, point X8, whatever. Suddenly, whether or not I'm doing ultimate, I've now had this kind of freedom opened up that allows me to engage with the system more, even if I'm not engaging with it for the gear. But if I am someone engaging with it for the gear, I'm now given this window with which I can focus on gearing those other jobs before the next ultimate even comes out. So I think that is really the crux of the issue. It's the freedom. And when it comes to tomestones, I have said, I think they might want to consider raising the cap about at the same time, about the time we get the odd numbered patches. So whether or not they want to go all the way to 900, like they do at the end of the expansion, that's on them. But I do think that needs to be taken heavily into consideration, because as we get more and more jobs, this is going to become more and more of a problem. There's another issue I want to touch upon, but it might be touched upon in one of the other points. So if I have to, if I remember, I'll come back to this. But great first point, completely agree, and curious to see what the rest of what he has to say is. All right, number 2, substats are a problem for balance and creativity. What creativity? And I think that's probably going to be the point. But yeah, we actually had a whole video about this as of late, talking about the problems with our substats, but I'll read this and then reiterate and add to it if I need to. In the current landscape of Final Fantasy XIV job design, there is an issue with damage variance from pull to pull, right on track. This is largely due to the design of both critical hit and direct hit stats, combined with the high burst damage profiles the game has trended towards, 2-minute buff windows. My major gripe with substats as they currently exist is the lack of impact. There's only one job remaining in the game which has any interaction with substats, Monk. I'm assuming he's talking about critting, giving you chakras. Yeah, I mean, they've gotten rid of pretty much all the rest of them. You know, it's just you either auto crit or you auto proc, or, you know, if you do proc, it's a chance on just an attack and not on an actual crit. So yeah, I mean, that's been pretty much all removed. Part of an appeal of RPG games is the character power growth and the feel that has on gameplay. As it stands, the only feedback I get that I am more powerful as a black mage is that my critical hit Xenoglossy hitting for 61k instead of 60k. And I want to add to that, because we had numbers in Shadowbringers that were brought down, as one would expect, the feeling of that impact is only relative to what you had just experienced before. But because we experienced something much more powerful before, even that doesn't have quite an impact. It's not even just the difference of 1k. It's knowing that at some point I was doing more than this. And even more so, I'm getting back to that value quite quickly, which almost informs the player that we'll probably have another stat squish, if not this expansion, the next, or they need to do something else to change the formula going into 7.0, because they probably didn't squish us enough to make it so that we get enough feedback from our stats to see that growth. It just feels like you took a tiny step back from the previous expansion, but not enough for it to be a long-term step. Let's see. Tenacity currently is a completely undesired stat. You can say that again. With the way incoming damage in 14 works. Spike damage profiles do not mesh with the low value of Tenacity's defensive stats when cooldowns are so powerful in comparison. Yeah, I wonder if it's a programming issue. I can't remember when I had this discussion with somebody else, but we talked about how Tenacity should probably bolster the actual effectiveness of defensive cooldowns because that's more in line with the game. But the problem is, even that, we have a very good balance of the way we can use our defensives. If we get a stat that makes our defensive stronger, I don't think that's any more appealing. It just is more well suited to this game and the way damage profiles are done as explained here. When cooldowns are so powerful in comparison. Yeah, hence why I think Tenacity would have to do that. But I mean, that's even why Tenacity has a damage component on it, because they understand that damage in 14 is more valuable than everything else. And the community has made that clear again and again and again. So outside of outright changing the value on outgoing damage in the game, which I don't think is going to happen ever, how do you make Tenacity a useful stat? And that's really the only way. At the very least, if somebody's defensives are a percentage stronger, you'd have to work in, micro percentages when it comes to defensive cooldowns, because you can't have like a 32% Rampart or like a 45% Sentinel or something like that. It can't be like massive numbers that it jumps up, which then of course comes to the issue of whether or not it's even worth it, if it feels like game design, The final major point about substats is the lack of interaction with speed stats. Generally, they are hugely undesired outside of low thresholds and then completely avoided. They create anti-synergy with job abilities in many cases and are sometimes out of the player's control. Yeah, this is a big thing. So first, I'd like to say there's no point in both skill speed and spell speed being a stat. We could probably just have haste and call it a day. But that's not a solution. That's just a high-level observation of this. Yeah, speed stats are so very rigid in Final Fantasy XIV because of the way these buff windows are designed. You're always trying to get an exact number of GCDs, an exact placement of those GCDs, or as close to exact as you can possibly get within a set period of time. There's very little, I'm doing the thing that my job is good at, and during this time, those things are just better. It exists to some degree, like Black Mage. Yes, Black Mage does have a proper 2-minute, like what they want an ideal window to look like, but it's a good example of something that's a little more fluid. You want to try to time getting as many fire casts in, getting your Xenoglossies, make sure that you use your, it gives you a free Xenoglossy, but I haven't played Black Mage much since I leveled it. Yeah, you just get a bonus Polyglot, essentially. You want to make sure all those cooldowns are lining up with 2s, but you're not sitting there trying to do exactly the same thing. You're not trying, you can move around and work around it a little bit better. Every other job, if you are like not on the GCD you need to be on when you go into a 2-minute window, you are screwed, and you're probably going to continue to be screwed for the rest of the fight, depending on how skilled you are at the job to adjust it, or how forgiving that job is even in the first place, which for a lot of jobs now isn't very many. So it just makes this really weird balance of speed stats. Essentially, I hate to have to say this, the speed stat's kind of like accuracy at this point. You want exactly enough and no more. And obviously there's a difference between how fast you're hitting and whether or not you're even able to land a hit, but it's the same mentality. And I guess there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but playing with different speeds is less of a personal decision on what feels good and more of an ideal circumstance. And I think that if there was anything that could make jobs more varied or different for players, it's more jobs that don't interact so strictly with the speeds. That comes down to just designing what the breakpoint windows look like. And that's very nuanced. I couldn't go into every job and all of that right now. But A complete truth. You know, it's funny. I actually thought he was going to touch upon something else that comes up a lot with substats in 14. It's not just that we have these high variance substats in the form of crit and direct hit, combined with high damage profiles, which lead to very swingy damage variance, but that our substats in general are not a strong point of Final Fantasy 14. You essentially have crit, direct hit, determination, and then whatever your stat is for, and then, you know, your speed stat, which, you know, you try to get to a set value, and then whatever stat is kind of exclusive to your role outside of direct hit, because direct hit, despite being a DPS stat that's designated for the DPS role, affects everyone. But piety and tenacity are specifically for healers and for tanks. So there's not very many of them, and the ones that provide the most damage will always be the most valuable. So it becomes a question of, do we just need different substats? People have suggested splitting critical hit and critical hit damage into two different stats. Does that actually help? We probably need our gear to have a different substat profile then. We probably can't just have two stats, because if crit rate and crit damage still are the most influential, then it becomes about stacking those two specific things. I recently had a discussion about mastery, a stat that could potentially affect your job in a particular way. Now, I'm not going to spitball what every job's mastery should look like, but the idea of going for a stat that boosts some specific effectiveness of your job, there's at least a chance that some jobs will choose to interact with that stat more, and other jobs will choose to kind of keep it at a set value. So it ranges anywhere from a stat that is highly desired to a stat that has some desirability, but not a whole lot. And you really want different jobs interacting with the different stats on some systematic level so that that decision making is even present. However, even if we do that, going back to point number one, another thing I'm very surprised he doesn't hit upon, it's not just that the gear has this acquisition rate that's low. It's even when you're within your own role, which again, he touched upon in the previous question, it's that sometimes you just don't even want the same piece, or you don't want the same meld, or you want something slightly different. So, you know, maybe every time you want to swap jobs between one of the casters, you got to change a meld. Nowadays, people are better at finding kind of these universal sets that at least work with one gameplay element of another job. So like if you want to go full spell speed, you know, Summoner and Black Mage can get identical, you know, close to identical for what they want. But now you've got Red Mage out, so he's like, oh, well, then I should probably go crit, because at least I can somewhat use that across all the jobs. But that's because skill speed and spell speed become so rigid. All these things just counterbalance each other. And then when you can only have one piece of loot and you can't do anything about the melds other than every time you want to swap, taking one out, putting one in, taking one out, put one in, whatever you have to do, it's restrictive in that regard as well. And that's been a complaint that Yoshi P himself has actually acknowledged, but that they haven't had any solution for since then. So again, these first 2 points really kind of dig into each other in a lot of ways. And I don't think Final Fantasy XIV needs to have a crazy amount of subsets. We don't need like lots of every piece has this like unique effect and everything like that. Could we? Probably. But we know the ramifications of that are balance related. And we also don't want that problem, because then we have to have this video about that. And the other video we made about balance looks like nothing compared to the discussion we end up having to have as a result. So what do we want to achieve here? We want to achieve better stat variety, less damage variance, more interaction with substats, and improving the substats we even have at the moment. That's a lot of things to cover. And you want to know the crazy thing about it all? Technically, if none of those things happened, Final Fantasy XIV would not have any more problems than it has now. And realistically, our problems with these kind of things are, again, not, I can't play this game, it's like this problems. There, I love this game, I just want it to be a little better problems. And because of that, if none of this changed, which it probably won't, I'll say it, it would just be Final Fantasy XIV still. And unfortunately, when something has that degree of impact, when it's almost barely noticeable by most people, even a lot of you watching this video are probably just wondering why we're wasting time talking about this. It just probably doesn't matter as much compared to getting gameplay out there, getting new content out there, focusing on job balance at the start of an expansion, what the new skills are, you know, all of that stuff. This seems like something that only people of our caliber are really, really after. People who look at that character growth and substat kind of mini game that you play in RPGs. but probably not the wider audience who just kind of enjoys Final Fantasy 14 for what it is and isn't so concerned about stuff like that. It's one of the toughest things about these kind of posts is you have to know where you kind of stand compared to everyone else. And the unfortunate answer is not probably in a point where this is a majority opinion, and thus change is not always super likely. Going on to point number 3, there's a lack of varied methods for acquiring max item level gear. Okay. Currently, a best in slot character interacts with tomestones in the latest Savage raid. Having only 2 sets of gear means acquiring best in slot is more restrictive than it should be. More available max item level gear sets would result in the ability to gear more jobs simultaneously, while also increasing the speed at which to obtain the total best in slot. A great example of a previous piece of content which added more gear was Proto Ultima side quest in Dunskaith. Is that a good example? Proto Ultima was at the end of an expansion and was added in like a 0.5 patch after we'd had Dunskaith available for quite some time. It gave us max item level accessories, and it gave it at a time where the raids had been out for so long that no one really cared how you were getting your item level at that point. You know, you could already get weekly upgrades for tomestones from the 24-mans. You could just get, the equivalent of an unupgraded tomestone piece from the 24-mans. So I guess this answer really depends on when you want that kind of gear to become available and how much you value the difficulty of that content versus the rewards it gives. This is a big discussion actually with Criterion right now. People wondering why we don't have tomestone upgrade materials, at least in the normal mode. You know, the Savage mode people initially said should probably have it, but realistically, it's the normal mode that's probably the better option for it. But that's not a new gear choice. That's better access to upgrade gear we currently have available. So it seems like he more wants optional side stuff that gives item level relevant accessories. I mean, we have had that. That's not the only example, but in the earlier days of Final Fantasy XIV, this was a little more common, and I never understood why they moved away from it. I think they started valuing the difficulty of the content versus the item level it was required or that it was providing. And they seem to be afraid to bring those things closer together than they already were. And they were pretty close. They still are to this day, just because of, what your rewards actually look like from a 24-man on any given week. So what really is the solution to this? I mean, because making whole new gear sets is probably not the most achievable thing unless you want to recycle more old gear sets and use them as higher item level. Do you just raise the item level rewards of certain things? This is one of those things that feels like it is more manpower related. Like you need more people to be able to design enough gear to even do this sort of thing. But the question then becomes, what type of content? I mean, he lists a 24-man side quest here. That's very easy content. Do we also want something that's still challenging? Or at that point, because it's catch-up gear, do we not care? It's just about weighing the options. I think, as I mentioned earlier, that catch-up gear should become available more quickly because people who or just get tired of doing the other set, want something else, another option for gearing alts or even their main if they haven't been putting as much time into it. When hardcore raiders actually want more gear for other jobs that they want to play or alt characters or any number of reasons they may want to be able to gear something else up a little more quickly. So this is one of those things, there's really no argument against it, but how you do it is the question. If you just take the most direct route or if you try to develop something in the process that gives you those options. I didn't even mention upgrading crafted gear. I mean, maybe you could even do like a super upgrade for crafted gear, like from something you reward another thing that allows you to upgrade the crafted gear even further, just like you would upgrade tombstone gear. That's a potential solution, going all the way up. Imagine getting that crafted gear at the start, doing the first upgrade for 10 item levels and doing a second content related upgrade for another 10 item levels. I mean, that doesn't inherently sound bad either. And that's the thing. A lot of these ideas aren't bad. They just need to fit within Final Fantasy XIV's content structure, or new content needs to be made around that fact. So yeah, I mean, this again ties back to the first point, in my opinion. And number 4, this final point is much smaller and more to do with current Savage release schedule and its interaction with the Criterion release. The Criterion Dungeon Savage mode was targeted towards players who had cleared Abysso Savage early in the tier and acquired plenty of loot. Unfortunately, it released at the start of the 8th week, meaning those wanting to go into content immediately were not yet guaranteed certain items requiring 8 books. Funnily enough, this came up during the live Q&A from the 14-hour broadcast. Somebody said, yeah, I'm really looking forward to it, but it's the 8th week. And like now it's a clash and we want to go get our gear and make sure we get the rest of what we have. So this becomes a question of, is Criterion Savage fully geared towards those best in slot people? I think it's more geared towards them, but not so much so in a way that if you had been raiding for 7 weeks up to that point, that you'd be at a major enough disadvantage going into that week. I think that it's definitely worth considering going back another week on Criterion, but I don't know. It's this one's another tough one because it does depend on what the exact internal item level is. Because again, we're talking about the Savage difficulty, not the regular difficulty, but the fact that it does clash specifically with the 8th week, if it continues to, will be a problem amongst the target audience, and that's really the important thing here. So yeah, no, that's a completely fair ask. I don't think anyone likes the idea of waiting another week for content. Well, I guess that's not true. I did ask for it for Savage for however many years before we finally got it, but a lot of people aren't a fan, so I'm the anomaly. And so that's definitely something to take into consideration. I think even Yoshida had said they would take it into consideration going forward when that question got posed on the live Q&A. But yeah, that is the last point. I want to reiterate that the positives of the current gearing system are a huge benefit to existing and prospective players. This post was made with the hopes that the gearing system can be even more appealing to a wider audience. Yeah, I feel like he achieved that. I think that might be why some of the points I brought up aren't in his post, because they are things that are more nuanced and not kind of high level. You know, they're ways that we interact with the game on a very personal scale. But I don't know, with an RPG, I feel like those are also points to consider. So these things we need to consider, especially the first 2 points, and then as an extension of the first point, the third point, how people feel as they're getting the gear and how that gear has an impact on their gameplay. But as I guess as an RPG junkie, I can't help but look into the nuances of it and try to think of what the absolute best solution is and how it interacts with the game as a whole. And that's a big question. I don't think any one person can answer that. And even if you think you do have the answer, it's probably not as simple as that. But a really good post, one that we rarely see these kind of posts, you know, the one that is genuinely criticizing the thing that somebody enjoys, looking to make it better and improve it for everyone else and themselves at the same time. So Sfia, great post. Again, if you want to interact with the post and get it more visibility on the official forums, please see the description of the video for the post. And of course, feel free to comment your thoughts under this video as well. But that's going to be a wrap for me analyzing what Sfia had to say about gearing in Final Fantasy XIV. With that, I will see all of you in the next video. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share. And until then, take care.